Absolutely.
what you have done.
Yes, and this is what we want.
So I very much like the design of this session.
Thank you. We're really
Yes.
pleased.
Ahora sí. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. Es un placer ver tantos rostros diferentes y conocidos. A las personas que nos acompañan también digitalmente, les damos la bienvenida. Estamos muy contentos y contentas de recibir a Tania Murray el día de hoy, por la oportunidad de escuchar, de aprender de ella, pero además porque a nosotros, como Laboratorio Interdisciplinario de Etnografía, la visita nos ha permitido reforzar algunas colaboraciones, en principio con el Centro de Estudios Sociológicos, con el Centro de Estudios de Asia y África y con el Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales de la UNAM. Estas actividades, o sea, la charla de hoy es una de las actividades que son motores del laboratorio y nos da mucho gusto que estés aquí porque estos espacios en donde podemos repensar, discutir y crear miradas nuevas sobre el quehacer etnográfico son centrales en nuestro quehacer. En este caso, con referencia a tu trabajo, un trabajo de una colega que tiene una trayectoria muy potente, rigurosa e inspiradora para muchas y muchos de los que estamos acá. Sin más preámbulo, les voy a presentar a los integrantes de esta mesa. Tania Murray es doctora en Antropología por la Universidad de Cambridge. Sus principales líneas de investigación incluyen política cultural y el estudio de comunidades urbanas en contextos multiculturales, el desarrollo y la crítica al concepto de gubernamentabilidad en proyectos ambientales y los dilemas sobre el uso de la tierra. Nos acompaña también Carlos Mondragón, que es profesor investigador del Centro de Estudios de Asia y África, quien es doctor en Antropología Social por la Universidad de Cambridge. Entre sus investigaciones se destaca la antropología ambiental con enfoque en el conocimiento tradicional y el cambio climático. Y también nos acompaña Ingrid Cano, artífice en buena parte de este encuentro. Ella es doctora en Antropología Social y Etnología por el CIESAS y la Universidad de París, West Nanterre La Défense, y ha centrado su investigación en la antropología política, el desarrollo socioambiental y los estudios rurales, analizando las transformaciones socioambientales. La dinámica del día de hoy será la siguiente. Comenzará Ingrid Cano presentando reflexiones sobre algunos puntos clave del trabajo de Tania Lee, alrededor de 10 minutos. Luego Carlos Mondragón y Tania Lee conversarán sobre el trabajo etnográfico que ella tiene en Indonesia por unos 20 minutos. Y por último, Ingrid Cano junto con Tania presentarán algunas reflexiones sobre la antropología y los estudios agrarios y ambientales por otros 20 minutos. Hacia el final esperamos que podamos recuperar sus dudas, quejas, sugerencias y propuestas. Muchas gracias de nuevo por estar aquí y por ser partícipes de este espacio.
Hola, mucho gusto. ¿Me escuchan? ¿Sí? Ok. Vale la pena mencionar que tendremos una hora para platicar con Tania, además de las presentaciones que tenemos aquí, porque después de nuestra intervención les damos la palabra al público para que puedan hacer sus preguntas en español o en inglés. Ok, anterior, por favor. Para empezar voy a dar los agradecimientos rápidamente. En primer lugar al Laboratorio de Etnografía, a todo el equipo y en particular a Jared por haberme acompañado en la rápida formación de este evento, al CES, a Sandra Hernández por la difusión en redes, a Elia también por el apoyo con la organización aquí dentro del CES y a Cecilia por apoyarme en la comunicación con Tania. Al Centro de Estudios de Asia y África, a Jorge Bayona, a Carlos Mondragón y a Christian Laundry por ayudarme a recibir a Tania Lee aquí. Y finalmente a Antonio Azuela del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales de la UNAM por ayudarme a hacer el vínculo entre Tania y el colegio. Muchísimas gracias, espero que lo disfruten. Ok, por favor. La siguiente diapositiva, por favor. Cuando iba a nombrar el evento, me pareció que era más fácil decir Indonesia rural hoy, porque consideraba que reunía con pocas palabras lo que vamos a trabajar aquí. Sin embargo, esa idea puede ser dar muchos imaginarios, y una de las cosas que me pareció que podía ser como imaginario es que aquí fuéramos a hablar, no sé, como de costumbres o de cuestiones simbólicas o cosas de ese estilo. Sin embargo, para quienes conocemos el trabajo de Tania Lee, tenemos claro que hablar de Indonesia rural hoy significa hablar del proceso de expansión de palma de aceite, de una serie de situaciones de despojo y de conflicto. Y justamente la imagen que elegí para dar inicio al evento representa muy bien lo que significa un importante y significativo cambio agrario para poblaciones en condiciones de marginación. Aclarado esto, por favor, me interesa mencionar rápidamente, porque nuestro interés es escucharla a ella, hablar de Tania Lee para aquellos que no la conocen, no la han leído. Entonces, para mí, algunos puntos claves de su trabajo es que es una antropóloga orientada a lo que titula un libro Viejos problemas nuevos. Me refiero a que Tania Lee se ha orientado a trabajar problemas clásicos para la antropología, la sociología rural. Todos los profesionistas de los estudios sobre el desarrollo, pero que pareciera que son temas que quedaron en el pasado y, bueno, al menos para algunos espacios académicos parece que quedaron en el pasado, pero son cada vez más presentes. Entonces, sus temas han estado en torno a la tierra, el trabajo, el capitalismo y las poblaciones rurales. También es una investigadora interdisciplinaria. Desde sus diálogos o de sus influencias con filósofos, entre los cuales destaco a Nicholas Ross, pero también diálogos muy fructíferos con la geografía, entre las que destaco a Gillian Hart. Por supuesto, sus diálogos o su reconocimiento dentro de la ecología política, y aquí destaco la cercanía que tiene con Nancy Peluso, y también un diálogo con los estudios agrarios clásicos marxistas que todavía persisten y reivindican en sus potenciales analíticos y académicos, entre los que destaco a Henry Bernstein. Por otro lado, Tania Lee es una antropóloga Foucaultiana, aunque no exclusivamente. Y como mencionaba Jared, aquí destacaría al menos dos conceptos que ella muestra, que explora y expande en sus investigaciones, y el primero de ellos es el concepto de gubernamentalidad, que hemos visto trabajar en muchos ámbitos de la antropología y las ciencias sociales, pero que ella explora concretamente en el tema de las políticas de desarrollo. Por otra parte, otra noción también Foucaultiana que destaca en algunos de sus trabajos es la noción de hacer vivir, dejar morir, también de Foucault, que aparece, que él comenta en el curso de Colegio de Francia en 1976, y que da lugar al concepto de biopolítica. Además, Tania Lee es una irruptora de discusiones, porque en su pensamiento ha tratado de ir más allá de discusiones que a veces se quedan cerradas o recicladas. Y aquí voy a mencionar solamente dos discusiones porque no me da mucho tiempo para hacerlo, y menciono particularmente las discusiones sobre desarrollo, que han sido fundamentales en particular para la antropología del desarrollo, pero no exclusivamente para ella. Y en ese contexto me parece que el trabajo de Tania ha sido fundamental para justamente apuntalar explicaciones que vayan más allá de cómo entender el desarrollo y cómo estudiarlo, y en ese sentido digamos que ilustrado muy bien de manera metafórica con uno de sus trabajos que voy a mencionar más adelante. Por otro lado, otra discusión que es fundamental para los estudios agrarios y que Tania ha sido innovadora en muchos sentidos es la discusión sobre la certidumbre y la incertidumbre agraria. ¿Y a qué me refiero en particular? Me parece que los planteamientos de Tania Lee han tratado de apuntar a que es fundamental trascender este debate, porque las circunstancias van mucho más allá de si se tiene certidumbre o no en la propiedad de la tierra. Esto, por supuesto, en un diálogo muy fructífero que deviene del trabajo de Jesse Ribot y Nancy Peluso, quienes fueron de los primeros que hablaron acerca de la diferencia entre propiedad y acceso. La siguiente, entonces, anterior, por favor. Entonces, en su primer trabajo, lo que nosotros podemos ver como creación de conceptos es el concepto de gubernamentalidad, y en particular, pues este concepto y esta frase que ella utiliza, con la que titula su libro, The Will to Improve, es una forma de entender las dinámicas del desarrollo, apelando también a la manera como toma cuerpo esta idea, no solamente entre los especialistas, los planificadores, sino entre las poblaciones rurales. Por otra parte, otro concepto que me parece fundamental en un libro que se llama Powers of Exclusion, que es un libro trabajado con otros dos investigadores, Derek Hall y Philip Hirsch. En este trabajo yo destaco la noción del doble filo de la exclusión, y es un concepto que crean entre los tres para justamente aludir a los problemas de la propiedad, de que los problemas de la propiedad o el problema de la exclusión no es solamente o mejor dicho, que la exclusión es al mismo tiempo que la apropiación, que los ejercicios de apropiación, perdón, son a la vez ejercicios de exclusión, y que en la posibilidad de mirar este doble filo de las cosas podemos profundizar en las contradicciones, los conflictos que se dan allá, más allá del asunto de la propiedad, y que implican muchas contradicciones para las poblaciones y los actores especialistas. Por otra parte, en su trabajo Lansen, me parece que un concepto clave ha sido el de relaciones capitalistas, y este es un concepto que parece sencillo, pero que, lejos de ser algo sencillo, apunta a una complejidad importante acerca de los cambios que han experimentado las poblaciones rurales, pero que con este concepto ella apunta a, de alguna forma, tal vez son mis palabras y la interpretación de su trabajo, pero me parece que apunta a romper una imagen idílica de lo comunitario, pero también de las poblaciones indígenas en condiciones de marginación. Y finalmente, porque no me queda mucho más tiempo para destacar entre sus conceptos, me parece que en su último libro producido o trabajado con Pujes Semedi, algo que me parece que es súper interesante en este texto es esta noción de que particularmente las poblaciones que experimentan la expansión de palma de aceite experimentan la doble situación de estar ocupados y abandonados, porque la expansión de la palma de aceite implica ver muchos cambios tanto a nivel ambiental como social y por supuesto de tipo urbano, pero muchas de estas cosas, ante muchos de estos cambios, algunas poblaciones, particularmente residentes de los bordes de las plantaciones, permanecen testigos sin necesariamente ser beneficiados de todo este proceso de cambio y de desarrollo agroindustrial. Si me preguntan por la fortaleza del trabajo de Tania, yo considero que una de sus cosas es el carácter heurístico de sus conceptos, los cuales han sido alcanzados en el diálogo interdisciplinario y a partir del trabajo de campo. También destaco la capacidad comunicativa de la etnografía en la interlocución con actores locales, activistas y especialistas. Por otra parte, resalto la asertividad para trascender las discusiones y explicaciones dicotómicas y la capacidad para exponer matizadamente las contradicciones y los dilemas propios de las relaciones de poder. Al respecto de sus aportes en los estudios agrarios y ambientales, yo destaco sus reflexiones para comprender las transformaciones de los mundos rurales con una perspectiva inductiva que reivindica el trabajo de campo etnográfico para dialogar con los estudios agrarios, los estudios ambientales, la geografía y la ecología política. Por último, el tipo de conocimiento que ella desarrolla más allá de discusiones y lugares comunes, por ejemplo, para atender el carácter ambiental o no de los conflictos, y por otro lado, para hacer preguntas que van más allá de las relaciones entre dominación y resistencia. Por todo eso, gracias, Profesor Lee.
¿Sí? Ok. Muchas gracias, Ingrid, por el repaso de temas y de cuestiones. A mí me toca la muy placentera tarea de hacer las preguntas y comenzar una suerte de conversatorio. En mi caso, pues el trabajo de la profesora Lee lo tengo más presente en términos de mi propia especialización de área. En pocas palabras, el Pacífico Occidental, Indonesia Oriental y demás. Pero tengo dos, digamos, líneas de interrogación que quería traer a la mesa. Una tiene que ver con el trabajo etnográfico de la profesora Lee. I'm going to ask these questions in English. I don't have anything as organized as a PowerPoint presentation and such, but so I'm saying I have two different lines of questions that I kind of want to get people to know where I'm going and then maybe start this up. Y la segunda tiene que ver con temáticas de investigación. So, in terms of ethnographic fieldwork, I'm very interested to ask you about long-term fieldwork. I know you've spoken about the possibilities that long-term relations with people, notably I'm thinking about Gorontalo, Northern Sulawesi, how this has opened up insights that wouldn't have been obvious to you if you carried out the usual sort of instamatic kind of picture on the ground. This is of special relevance to me because I've also engaged in a long-term sort of project with the people in the Western Pacific that I work with. But it tends to be an exception and not the rule, and certainly I find that to be the case as well in our in the Mexican anthropological medium. So could you speak a little bit about how that developed? I know that each one of us, if we engage in long-term fieldwork, it's a project that we don't necessarily lay out at the beginning. How did that work for you? Did you find, how did social relations with people on the ground develop over time? How did that help you to acquire different insights in what you were doing? What would you say were the 2 or 3 greatest gifts or results that came from this kind of engagement?
Okay, thank you. So, good afternoon. Thank you to Ingrid, to Carlos, to the organizers. It's a great pleasure, privilege to be here. I can understand Spanish, so if you want to make questions in Spanish, it's fine, but my Spanish is not really good enough to explain my ideas, so I'm going to respond in English. Okay, so long-term field work. So you're right, Carlos, that I did not start out the work which became this book. Land's End was a result of 20 years of field work, which I started on a postdoc around 1990 and then finished the last field work in 2009, so almost 20 years. And you're right that I didn't plan it, and if I had planned it, I might have done it differently. I think most people who talk about long-term fieldwork talk about the importance of the baseline and the data that you have at the beginning. So it wasn't ideal, and I never spent more than 3 months in that place. So I think many long-term projects start with a dissertation, which is long-term and embedded, and then continue. But this wasn't my dissertation work. So I never had, I think the shortest was 2 weeks, the longest was 12 weeks. I have to be frank, there was also a language issue, because although I speak fluent Indonesian, these people mostly don't speak Indonesian. So the indigenous language I never really mastered. And I worked with an interpreter, and I learned a functional vocabulary of maybe 200 words. But the key words related to kinship, land, property, agriculture, you know, a functional vocabulary, but I couldn't speak the language. So those are the limitations. The positive, or the plus, is that when I started that research in 1990, I realized that something big was happening. I think most field workers actually experience that. It's like something big is always happening in our field sites. We often feel we're on the cusp of something. It's a common feeling. But what was happening at the time was that, you know, indigenous highlanders were starting to plant cocoa in their corn and rice fields. So it was effectively enclosure from below, because in their own indigenous understanding, when you plant a tree crop, a perennial, then this land no longer goes back into the common pool to circulate among your cousins and neighbors, but becomes privately owned. So it was a process of bottom-up indigenous privatization, enclosure. And then what I went back the next year, and this is happening more and more. And then 5 years later, there's no more food being grown at all, because all the land is now covered with cocoa trees. So something which the people had announced at the beginning, oh, this will just be an extra cash crop for us. Of course, we'll always grow food. How could we not grow food? It was so obvious. In fact, it changed. And so then when I realized the depth of this transformation, which, you know, Karl Polanyi tells us is the complete transformation of society, the privatization of land, the emergence of private property. And what I then became very curious about was, how did they do this without much fuss? Like, they didn't seem to be, for them, it didn't seem to be this big, grand transformation. It was a process that they navigated themselves in terms of their own priorities. Of course, there were conflicts, like, you know, who will plant their cocoa trees where, and some people were being too ambitious and monopolizing land, and sometimes in the night someone would come and their cocoa trees were burnt. So, you know, on the ground maneuver in the process, but no one actually challenged the idea of privatization. No one articulated a concept of a commons to be preserved. And although in theory they liked the idea of food production, they said actually our food production was never very stable. The El Nino droughts caused catastrophic food crises regularly every few years. How wonderful to plant cocoa, especially the women, they said. You know, you can just reach up your hand and pluck a cocoa pod and dry it, the seed, and turn it into money, and you can go to the market and buy a sack of rice, and that is so much easier. So, you know, it did upset many of the suppositions about indigenous people will be committed to subsistence, will be committed to food production, will want to retain their commons, will be opposed to private property relations. And here there's people doing it themselves, you know, under their own rationale, not seamlessly, but it was their process. So that became the interest to continue to go back, to find out, well, how are they doing this? Like, how do you, at the moment where you now have established private property, you have your cocoa fields, and let's say your sister has failed, and she now has no land. So do you still feed your sister? Do you feed her children? Like, how are social relations renegotiated as class structure emerges? But this isn't a class of strangers. This is a class emerging among neighbors and family members. So, you could say a study like that really couldn't be done in the short term, because seeing how they did it and what happened next, and as the crisis of land became more acute, did people start to question and doubt their decisions? And did we go on, or did they just say, it's true, Tanya, every time you come back and we sit down and because I had made land records early, so I would go through the land records asking who's buying, who's selling, just basically find out what had happened. And they would say, it is true, some people are gaining and some people are losing. Life is like that. So, that did not, for them, provoke a sort of crisis of the kind that our theory would expect, right? So how can you, so then you have, as an anthropologist, then you have a puzzle, like it's something unexpected, something which theory did not predict, but which your ethnography is telling you, right? This is a process which is being generated and managed and debated from below, so what exactly is going on here? So I think that's the opportunity of long-term work, because you get to go back and see what happened, and then see what happened next. And then when things go badly, do doubts arise, or is there a new rationalization? Another element of the long term that you were referring to is, of course, the social relations that you form. So as I have confessed, mine were not as close as they would have been if I spoke the language better. But they were good enough that I could go back, and I had known people who were children, like peering in the door when I spoke to their parents. 20 years later, they're 30-year-olds, right? But they remembered me, and I remember you used to come and talk to my mom and talk to my dad, and so it produces a density of contact. But the other thing it produces, I think, is it comes back to this idea of vocabulary. Like, I do believe if I had started my study in 2010, the year I finished it, and if I had asked people about the past, they would not have been able to reconstruct the land sharing system and the agrarian system that existed. But because I was there 20 years before, and because I knew the words, I could ask them using the indigenous idioms for different kinds of land use, forest, etc. We could have a serious conversation about the past, which would not have been possible if I had just arrived, seen the contemporary environment, and asked about the past. I don't know if that's clear,
Absolutely,
but I think
yes.
that's the benefit.
Yes,
Yeah.
this is brilliant. And also, it comes to this second question I want to ask you, which is to do with theory, and the place of theory in your work. Precisely because you've also spoken very articulately about the non-linear sort of realities on the ground, which tend to be straitjacketed into these categories of expectation by different outside forces and actors. I remember notably this your talk at LSE, which strangely I watched just before I was told you were coming, where you were speaking about the World Bank lining up all the countries where along a line of progression, as it were, in terms of development and what was it development and was it land use or just simply, I think, economic structures. I can't remember, property regimes or something like that. But the point being that this happens to theory as well. It gets ahead of itself, and it tends to create expectations of what we're meant to find when we arrive. And you have spoken in very subtle sort of ways about ethnographic theory. And I mean subtle because I do have in mind colleagues who are much more who who are much louder about ethnographic theory and its importance, whereas I find it to be something that one should just allow to emerge, you know, rather than trying to pursue it as a thing in itself. The thing about ethnographic theory being, of course, that you arrive with a more open-ended notion of what you're going to do, rather than, I mean, yes, you may say, you know, you may have Foucault or Marx in mind, but you're not going to foreground these ideas before you arrive and see what's going on. And this is another part of your work that I've always found very appealing, which is you don't go straight to capitalism with a big C, or, you know, you don't go straight to power relations, you know, with a big P and R, but rather you kind of tease things out, such as you've just done right now when you've told us it's essentially they were acting as kind of capitalists by their own kind of, you know, agency, as it were. So regarding ethnographic theory, I think this is important, speaking as a, you know, as an environmental anthropologist, which was the field I'm most identified with. I find theory is often a very fraught thing. How do you deal with that? Because I find that you tend to have a set of authors and ideas in mind, but you're not necessarily fussing about them as you're carrying out your work or your exposition once it's published. How do you deal with theory in ethnographic terms? I'm sorry, this might seem a deeper question than it's meant to be.
Yeah. Okay. So I think you've already, you know, stated quite well, right? I mean, we all have theories in mind. We've been trained, and I think in Land's End, I argued that, you know, I can't imagine starting any piece of rural research without Marx in mind. Like this question of, that Henry Bernstein made into a famous haiku, right? Who owns what? Who does what? Who gets what? What do they do with the profits, right? I mean, these questions seem to me, you know, I learned them in college, but they seem to me indispensable as starting points. Like, I would always want to know those things, any rural context, or perhaps even an urban context. So some theories are just, you know, they just orient an inquiry in a way which is indispensable, for me anyway. So that's always there. But then there's the question of, that's just the starting point, right? And then what else will you find? So with Land's End, I thought, you know, in terms of what's the story you're going to tell, you know, at one stage I thought, is this a story about commodities? Is this a story about individualism? Because it turns out these Highlanders are quite individualistic. But I realized, actually, it's a story about the emergence of capitalist relations. Not capitalism as a kind of a singular thing, but this specific set of relations in which, again, I went to theorists, to Alan Wood and other fellow, whose name I'm forgetting right now.
I'm subjected now
to Robert Brenner. Right. So again, drawing on my theoretical reading, but later, so you've already done the study, and now I'm trying to figure out how can I make sense of what happened here. So this is kind of, there's your orienting theory, and there's your field work, and then there's your analysis and your decisions about what you can actually do with this material. And Brenner and Wood had made an intervention into this question of capitalist relations, which I found very powerful. Because what they argued was that it's not about market, non-market. Like, these people have been commodity producers, actually, like most Mexicans have been commodity producers for millennia, right? It's not markets which are new. These are not people who are baffled by markets. They're not baffled by money. That's not what's new. So what is actually the critical shift which happened in these mountains to go from being market producers to actually capitalist relations. And their definition is what they call a switch point. So when you engage in markets when opportunity presents, so I've produced too many carrots, there's a market for carrots, I'll sell my carrots, everyone needs money, like that's market as opportunity. What they call capitalist relations is market as compulsion. So the most obvious example is, I am now landless, I am compelled to sell my labor every day or starve. So my engagement in the labor market is no longer on the basis of opportunity. I have a free day, my neighbor wants help, I could use some money. That's, you know, labor as opportunity, as market as opportunity, to I now have to sell my labor. So for small-scale producers, they argue there's a similar switch point. The point at which you cannot pull back and say, I don't want to sell anything because the market is not conducive, because the trader is a thief, I just want to come back and grow my own food. At what point can you not do that? So now you are compelled to sell what you have grown at a competitive market price, or you lose your land. So that's exactly that tipping point. So again, you know, I drew on this. These theorists helped me to clarify what exactly had changed here. So they provided me the vocabulary. But I wouldn't have been asking those questions if they hadn't been generated ethnographically. Like, it was because I'd seen something happen, and I was trying to figure out what actually happened here. How can I explain this thing? So I think, for me, theory comes in twice. You know, first as an orientation to the field, and then you do your fieldwork guided by these questions, but you wear it lightly, you know, loosely, you're open to many findings. And then when you're trying to figure out, of the many things I could analyze here, what will I focus on? And then what is the theory that's most powerful? So in relation to my other sort of big book, Will to Improve, like some scholars said to me, you cannot have Marx and Foucault in one book. You cannot have them in one anthropologist. It's like, are you a this or a that? You know, choose. And so I argued in the introduction that, in fact, I needed both these theorists, but I needed them for very specific purposes. Because the ethnographic field showed me that more than one thing was going on. On the one hand, there was a whole set of authorities attempting to govern, improve, correct, fix things for the local population. Marx had nothing to say about this. There was no theory in Marx which could help me to understand this will to improve, this governing, this intervening. So I needed Foucault for that. Foucault, on the other hand, had nothing to say about class relations and how people get dispossessed and what happens on an agricultural frontier. I needed Marx for this, right? So I made the argument that you may actually need more than one theory, but what you have to do is to explain to the reader why they're here. Like, I go here because it enables me to do this, but it doesn't help me with that, therefore I must go here. So the introduction to that book took me, at one stage it was probably 100 pages and full of references to this, that, and everything. And then it took me a long time to write the short version when I was really able to refine it and think, okay, actually, I don't need all of these theories and theorists. I really just need two. And I can explain why I need them, and we can move on. So it's an engagement with theory, but it's not just for the sake of a very thick introduction, which is very discouraging for the reader and very confusing. And so, but I didn't learn this by myself. It was one of my friendly critics who who read the introduction and said, oh boy, there's far too much going on here. You should scrap it completely and start again and tell us in your own words, what is this book about? what are the ideas you're working with? Why are these the ideas you found most compelling? And on we go. And of course they were right? So it was half as long and twice as good, twice as useful. So, but again, I think the ethnography is part of that, because being able to figure out what is it that I need to explain, what is going on in the world that I need to explain, that's what orients you towards, well, what is the body of theory that's most powerful for that problem? So you see in Land's End, there is no Foucault. And that's not because I forgot Foucault, but nobody was governing. Nobody was trying to intervene in anything. There was no governing going on. Foucault would have been quite useless in that context. But 100 kilometers away, the site of Will to Improve book, same province, different area, there were all kinds of environmentalists and conservation and the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank and the national government. And there was layers and layers and layers of people busy trying to diagnose problems and improve things. So Foucault came in, right? So I think this idea, that it really is an interplay. You start out with something, you see what you find, then you have to figure out what's most useful. And I always say to students, any term which you introduce, you have to really do it, deliver it. Don't just, I call it the blip on the radar. It's blip, it came, it went. It came, it went. It didn't go anywhere, it didn't do anything. That's not useful. So if you're going to introduce an idea, like governmentality, for example, or capitalist relations, work it, make it actually do the work, rather than have it just sit as a sort of object. I think that's the way I use
corporate occupation,
for example.
Right. Which, this is the point where I would love to get into the thick sort of insider conversation on your impressions about the various different, very important perspectives on environment and policy that emerge from Indonesia. There are wonderful scholars doing work there. I, for example, maybe we can talk about this later, because this is not what I'm going to ask you about. But so people like Sophie Chow and her work. But rather than go there, I'd like to take my last question to an issue that has become increasingly important, I'd say, over the past 15 years or so, which is working with either local informants, people, or scholars. And you've done plenty of that in recent years. Rather than ask you specifically, I would just say, this has become, it's almost kind of, it's something that almost goes without saying. But I find it's become, almost, I can't think of continuing to do certain kinds of work without just greater integration of people's perspectives and work with my own. How have you navigated that?
Right. So like most people, I started out as a solo researcher, as a doctoral student, as a postdoc. And I gradually acquired collaborators over time, and you find out who's really interesting, who wants, has common ground. So finding the right collaborators is a long process. And I've had very different kinds. So with Will to Improve, it was activists. I would call scholar activists. And the link there was that, I would show up at their NGO every year or every couple of years and say, I'm interested in this question, what are you guys working on at the moment? Do we have a match? And then we would find a match, and then we would do the research together, and then they would go and do their activist work and raise hell, which is their job, and I would go home and write articles, which is my job, right? So same pool of data, but different stakes. And it was a wonderful relationship. I think it was good for, what I brought was my training in research. I know how to do that, right? So it's exhausting, because 3 months of fieldwork includes endless, I would conduct an interview with 2 or 3 young staff from the NGO, and afterwards we would talk about what had come out of it, and they would say, and I would tell them what I thought was going on, and they were completely amazed. They said, we were in this interview, we didn't get any of that. Right? So you realize that actually being trained as a researcher gives you a capacity to, you know, analyze things, which you have to learn it. Like, we learned this through decades of very expensive training, and these NGO activists, they need training in how to do research, how to pose questions, and so on. So that was that one. With Pujo, he, like me, he's a anthropology professor, economic anthropology, very similar field. And I would say he's politically quite conservative. We're not really on the same page in general, but the wonderful thing about Pujo is he's an empiricist. It's like he actually believes in fieldwork and what comes out of fieldwork. So we were a perfect match on that sense. So he was very invested in fieldwork and training also. We had more than 100 students involved. So what I found extraordinary, and I think is something that I really learned, was that 2 of us, with our similar and different training and similar and different background, like he grew up the son of plantation workers and did his PhD in the Netherlands, a bit more cultural than me. You know, I come from a very different background, PhD in England, more Marxism than him, for sure. And what we would be, as we conducted the fieldwork, what we realized is that what he noticed and found important and noteworthy and surprising, and what I've identified, were not at all the same things. And so it was extraordinarily rich to see the things which he took for granted, but I found curious, and the things that I took for granted that he found curious. And these provided for us new frontiers of investigation. It made me wonder why people don't do this all the time. It's like 2 heads really are better. And 2 heads with, you know, a wonderful friendship, but different positions, different histories, different theoretical positions, is actually good, right? 2 people with the same thoughts wouldn't be as useful. So for example, day 1 in the plantation, he noticed plantation workers sitting at the little coffee shop by the river having coffee all morning. And I thought, yeah, they're having coffee. And he said, these people are stealing. What do you mean they're stealing? Look, he said, they're wearing their plantation uniforms, so they are advertising the fact they are government employees, and they're not working. So this is like blatant theft of time and demonstration of impunity. So he's onto a mode of analysis about the plantation as a regime of kind of theft, which wouldn't even have occurred to me. I thought these were just guys drinking coffee. And so it was like he noticed something which I would have missed. I probably would have got there eventually, but not on the first morning, right? And then similarly, I noticed things which he had never considered. So I think it's definitely very productive. I think in the North American Academy anyway, it's still very unusual in anthropology to actually do both fieldwork and writing together. I'd have to say that, you know, the fieldwork is one thing, the writing is very challenging. And his original idea was that he would write a couple of chapters and I would write a couple of chapters, and then I would create sort of master version. And then what I found, but I have to back up and say, when I first asked him at the beginning what did he want out of this partnership, he said he wanted to be a proper colleague and he didn't want to be the native informant or the research assistant. So his experience of working with foreign scholars is that what they really want is not an intellectual collaborator, but a research assistant and a native informant. And he did not want this role. And I said, well, you're on, let's try. Let's see if we can do this. Can we sustain this as an intellectual partnership to the end and not fall back into this mode of the more well-known, more widely read, stronger writer, me, kind of taking over the narrative of the book. And so that took a huge amount of work, you know, because every time we had to have protocols. It's like every time we basically agreed never to work on the text separately. Because if it was in my hands, I would go, and I'd be off in my world, and I would leave him behind. And we were trying not to do that. So if we're going to write, you know, a few paragraphs today, he had to be part of it, every step. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's definitely, I do feel with this book, with that book, and also with Powers of Exclusion, that I could not have done alone what we did collectively. So it was good. Yeah.
Thanks so much for that, Tania. Of course, it makes me think. The other colleague I have in mind who does this kind of work wonderfully is Paige West at Columbia. She's been doing a lot of that collaborative stuff. But anyway, I don't want to take more time because we want to open this up to conversation with everybody. I have like half a dozen more things I'd love to ask, but I'll shut up now. Gracias.
Voy a estar más corto.
No te preocupes, o sea, vamos bien. Ok, vamos a pasar a una sección un poco más interdisciplinaria, dado que hay muchos lectores de Tania que trascienden la antropología y nuestras obsesiones con el trabajo etnográfico y el dato etnográfico. Y eso me parece muy importante, en el sentido de que ella tiene un diálogo muy nutritivo con muchas áreas de investigación contemporánea. Entonces voy a lanzar estas preguntas, si me ayudas, por favor. Las voy a leer en español para el público hispanohablante. La primera es: en América Latina, el indigenismo hace referencia a un proyecto político en el que han intervenido diferentes actores, incluida la Academia Antropológica. Recientemente, algunos académicos que promueven los derechos y la autonomía indígenas, así como el pluralismo jurídico, han contribuido a una reactualización del proyecto más que a un profundo análisis de sus efectos. En este contexto, ciertas corrientes antropológicas parecen impermeables a la comprensión y discusión de los procesos de indigenización, tanto en el pasado como en el presente. ¿Observas esta tendencia en los contextos de Indonesia? ¿Qué reflexiones puedes ofrecer a los antropólogos al respecto de lo que Trouillot llama el nicho del salvaje?
Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you. So, since you asked me about the Indonesian context, I'll give just a brief introduction to what the question of indigenism is in Indonesia. So this concept of indigeneity actually arrived in Indonesia about 1993, which was the International Year of Indigenous People. And it was discussed by activists who had been working with villages who were affected by exclusion due to the law, because Indonesia's land law does not recognize customary land rights. They had also been affected by the government's declaration of 65% of the national territory as state forest, in which all of the people living in this forest, about 40 million people, have no rights. So a massive dispossession through the declaration of a forest boundary. They were also being displaced by plantations, mines, timber concessions, and there were also concerns about environment and diversity loss. So this was a period in which activists were concerned about these issues, and then along comes this discourse of indigeneity, and what the activists saw was a resonance or a connection between the kinds of problems which rural Indonesian people were facing: dispossession, loss of access to land, state claims, etc. And so they started to use, they developed a term which got translated as indigenous people. But from the beginning, it was an awkward fit in Asia, as in most of Africa, where we're not talking about a settler society, right? Here you have clearly an indigenous population, you have a settler population, you also have 5 centuries of mestizaje, so that's another story. But the idea that there could be indigenous people in Mexico, you would know who they are. Potentially. Possibly. And it could be a moving target. In Indonesia, at that time, I interviewed the NGOs who were getting into this, and I asked them, how many indigenous people do you think there are in Indonesia? And the answer ranged from 2 million to 40 million. So clearly, the subject they had in mind was not the same subject. For some of them, indigenous people were extremely remote, couldn't speak Indonesian, hunter-gatherers, not educated, outside state systems, maybe 2 million of those kinds of people, like truly the savage slot kind of idea. For others, they said, no, it's all rural Indonesians whose customary land rights are not recognized by the government, and that's almost all of them. So almost all rural Indonesians would be indigenous in this sense that they rely on customary land rights which the government does not recognize and which are vulnerable to expropriation. So in that case, it's a very large definition. So you can see the challenge the movement has had in moving between this concept and identifying like who actually does this discourse connect with, like empirically, and what is its progressive or retrogressive potential. So as a social movement, I would have to say it has not been successful. Like most rural Indonesians have never heard of the concept of indigenous people. Indonesia does not recognize the UN declaration or the ILO declaration. It has no resonance in Indonesian law. There's no recognition of international law on this topic. So it's a very different situation than you have here, where these not only national legal regimes, but also transnational legal regimes have created a real stake in being indigenous, which does not exist in Indonesia. So what the government has been willing to do is to recognize a very few, very remote people and congratulate itself for its progressiveness. But 40 million Indonesians are still chronically without secure land rights because their customary rights are not recognized. Only something like less than 50% of rural land parcels are titled. Most people access land on a customary basis, which works fine every day. I know what's mine, you know what's yours. We won't interfere with each other. If we have a dispute, we'll go to some elders and they'll help us solve our dispute, right? That's a rough and ready customary land system, and it works fine until a plantation corporation or a government agency wants to take it from you, in which case that customary system is suddenly not powerful at all. And okay, so that's the context. So in terms of the anthropology and the anthropologists, I would say that actually it hasn't, the leading edge of this hasn't been anthropology, it's actually been the activists and certain groups of activists, many with anthropology training, but who exist mainly in the kind of NGO sphere. And some of them have certainly been gatekeepers for this idea of the properly indigenous person. So when they read Land's End, or when I discussed it with them, they were horrified. They were appalled because they said, these are not real indigenous people. Real indigenous people would never do that. They would never privatize their land. They would never plant cocoa, right? They have a very fixed concept of who qualifies as properly indigenous. But when they actually try to find these people, what they actually find is much more like that, right? They find that most rural Indonesians have long been market engaged. They're not invested in autonomy. They're not anti-market. They're not anti-capitalist necessarily. They're certainly opposed to their land being grabbed from them, for sure. Right? So it's a situation where you could say it's a discourse in search of a subject, and at the same time, the risk and the problem, which I think is the one that you're also aware of, is that so much of the rural dynamic remains unexplored. If you're only looking for the pure subject, the properly indigenous, ecologically attuned, in love with the commons, like if those are the only people you're interested in and that you want to study, and you again study these people again and again and again, the other 98% of the population, rural population, you will consider them uninteresting. So I had real difficulty I tried to get some of the actors, I said, come with me, come and see. And they said, no, that's not interesting at all. Those are not proper indigenous people. And in relation to the plantation work as well, people who are looking for the indigenous subject, they regard these plantation areas as ruined landscapes. It's like there's nothing beautiful there. There's nothing autonomous. There's nothing authentic. There's nothing ecological. So why would we want to go and study that? It's so sad, so uninspiring, right? So I think it produces an unevenness of our attention. Like my sense is that we should be interested in all of it, not just in a very select component of the rural landscape. We should be interested in those people for sure, and all the others, who just do not fit that slot, that niche. Yeah.
En su producción académica no hay mención directa al debate antropoceno-capitaloceno. Sabemos que se trata de nociones que se utilizan para categorizar la actual crisis ambiental global, pero también para poner de relieve las relaciones de poder relacionadas con esta crisis y las desigualdades entre las sociedades humanas. ¿Se trata de un silencio estratégico? ¿Cómo puede describir su posición analítica frente a este debate?
Okay. Did you integrate my slides? Yes. Okay. Thank you, Ingrid. So it's true, I haven't been very invested in that debate. I mean, I think capitalism for sure, but this debate was shifted a bit with this idea that it's, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, Plantationocene, as another iteration. And that one actually made more sense to me. And I would like to just briefly show you why. So this is the graph of cocoa production in Indonesia. The blue line is Indonesia. The other ones are Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. And what you'll see is that in this period of 20 years, Indonesia went from 0 to 3rd global producer of cocoa. Siguiente. And all of it was produced, this is the territory of Land's End, by people like this, mountains. Siguiente. This is a cocoa farm. This is the guy's house. This is indigenous cocoa production, small scale, massive impact, right? It made Indonesia the 3rd largest producer, and all of it was grown by people like this, right? By highland farmers, lowland farmers, converting some or all of their land to this crop because there was a boom for cocoa, the price was good. And huge transformations followed, as I showed in Land's End, but it was very much a organic project. There were no corporations involved. So if it was capitalism, it wasn't, corporate imposition. It was people getting into the market. And it turns out that the first coffee boom in Indonesia occurred around 1720, and there was another one around 1820. So indigenous Indonesians have a long history of jumping into global crop production when there's a good opportunity. Coffee, cocoa, rubber, if it looks lucrative, they do it. And then if the market collapses, they do something else. Or sometimes if they still have land, they withdraw into food production until the next crop boom comes along. So this is a long history of what one could call capitalist relations, but capitalist relations integrated more or less into customary land regimes and indigenous production systems. So the contrast, siguiente. So this is oil palm concessions in Indonesia and Malaysia. So the white lines are the the boundaries of 13,000 separate concessions, which now cover 22 million hectares, 1/3 of Indonesia's land mass, Indonesia's agricultural land. So this is an entirely different thing. This is what we call corporate occupation. This is people being occupied, whose land is being occupied by corporations to such an extent that the local folk, and it is a total transformation of the landscape, like all of the trees, the villages, the rubber, the mango trees, like everything that was there before has gone. It's replaced by this linear landscape. Siguiente. And these are the people who, behind them now is oil palm, and they have nothing. These are the people, this was their customary land. Right? These were the people who lived there before, and now here they are on the edge of the river with their landless. They're not even employed by the companies because the companies prefer migrant workers who are more from other parts of Indonesia, who they consider more disciplined. And so these are the people that Ingrid mentioned earlier, who are, spectators. They see wealth being produced. They see wealth flowing away to corporations and big shots, and they have nothing. So this is, I think, a plantation scene, right? This is an entirely different kind of rural in which large-scale corporate entities not only take up all the land, but they also control the state. Because imagine if you live here and you have a complaint about water pollution or loss of land, who are you going to complain to? The government grants concessions to these corporations because these corporations are supposed to be acting in for the purpose of national development, bringing jobs and development to remote areas. So they have the full support of the state apparatus, and these people are just regarded as in the way. They are not needed, they are just in the way. And so they are confined to these small areas and occupied and abandoned. So that's where I think this debate gets, capitalist scene is too big because what is the nature of these capitalist relations? What is the format? What is the extent? Like even these people, there was a colonial plantation here which occupied a few hundred hectares. And actually the people welcomed it. They said it was fine. We just went around the edge and we could farm over there. The plantation managers allowed us to sell our food to the workers. The workers married our children. They formed kinship. So they did not regard it as an occupying force. That's one plantation, a few hundred hectares. Like 22 million hectares, one after the other with no space between. That is an entirely different world. Right? That's not the same thing. So that's where what I think is kind of really, at least in terms of the the rural scene. And as you have written, Ingrid, it has nothing to do with the crop. It's not the oil palm, which can be grown by smallholders perfectly well. It's the corporate form and the extent of it, and its integration with government and political life. Yeah.
Y una última pregunta. En la publicación Beyond the Proper Job, coescrita con James Ferguson, ofreces una reflexión muy relevante para analizar y dar cuenta de las transformaciones de las ruralidades contemporáneas. Se trata de una publicación del Instituto de Estudios sobre la Pobreza, la Tierra y los Asuntos Agrarios. ¿Podrías decirnos en qué contexto se produjo esta colaboración y cuáles eran tus preocupaciones y objetivos?
Right, so this was another wonderful collaboration, not actually so much with that institution, but with James Ferguson, who you may know died 2 weeks ago, very sadly. Yes, a wonderful colleague. So he worked in Southern Africa, I'm working in Asia, and what we realized was, in some ways, we were both telling a very similar story about joblessness. So in South Africa, it was a question of an industrial economy which at one stage absorbed a lot of labor, then became more mechanized, massive unemployment in Southern Africa, educated, unemployed, joblessness. So his was like a de-industrial situation, or a reduction of employment. I was dealing with contexts in Asia of people being recently pushed off the land for whom there were no jobs. So both of us were questioning what we call this transition narrative, that there's some inevitable progression from country to city, from farm to factory, from informal work to the proper job. This is the narrative which you find in every World Bank report. It still expects the transition of Europe in the 18th and 19th century to be reproduced in the global south in the same way, right? As if in each and every country there will be an agrarian transition, there will be new jobs generated in urban. But why would there be, right? If you're pushed off the land in Indonesia, in fact, the manufacturing jobs are in China. They're not in Indonesia, right? There's nothing in Indonesia. And why would you expect that in every national domain you would have the jobs generated just when you need them, right? So an interruption of this narrative of transition was one thing we were interested in. But the other one was the sense that we both had of the failure of what we called grand narratives. So on the one hand, there's the grand narrative of transition, which I just critiqued. The other one is the grand narrative of what Jim liked to call apocalyptic neoliberalism. So he argued that the tradition in scholarship, he's talking also about the North American scholarship, but I think it's been true in Latin America as well, right? That this idea that there is a singular thing called neoliberalism, and that it shapes every aspect of our contemporary era, everything can be explained by it, is oversold. That actually the kinds of transformations going on in different parts of Africa, in different parts of Asia, in different parts of Latin America are far more diverse than that. Right? Some people are losing access to jobs. New jobs are also being created. Some people are moving to the city. In Indonesia, city people are moving to the plantations. So it's like, in fact, there's a far greater diversity of processes transforming everyday life. And Jim always insisted on the point that they're not all bad. Like many rural people, urban poor, actually believe that their lives are getting better, right? Even though that it's a struggle, that their children's lives are a bit better than the lives of their parents. Now, this is not true everywhere, but it is part of the story. In large parts of sub-Saharan Africa, people are quite optimistic about the future. In other parts, it is an apocalypse, right? So basically what we felt was needed was a kind of return to fairly fundamental empirical research to investigate the very different kinds of transformation going on in different places where we're working, which wouldn't be overdetermined either by the optimistic transition narrative, it's going to get better, or the apocalypse narrative, but would be more open to the different kinds of experiences that people have. So that was the idea of it, and we did think of it as a kick for anthropologists, our students and others, or a hope that a new generation would pull back from these over-muscular, over-determined narratives and be interested in looking again at, what actually is happening here, right? Maybe actually we don't know, or maybe it's different for the young and the old, or for the women and the men, or for the, there's just too many processes in play. Should we not be interested in these as such? So to kind of restore an empirical and open-ended inquiry, which is respectful of, and in fact embraces diversity, the diverse sets of experiences and the contradictions. Don't expect it all to add up to one master narrative or one master theme. So we came up with a few questions. The first one, what is or is not changing about work? So are new kinds of work being generated? Are old kinds being lost? Formal or informal, men or women? Is it a case that everything's becoming casual and outsourced, or is it becoming bonded and captured, or outsourced there, bonded here? Actually all of these things are going on. What is the changing uses and meanings of land? Right? We have to move away from the idea, the old agrarian studies idea that we are only interested in land as a productive resource. It can be that. Can also be homeland, can be family compound, can be security in times of economic distress, can be ethnic homeland. Land actually does and means many different things, which we should be interested in. The third one, what are the other ways in which people access livelihood resources? So again, an agrarian studies focus was very much on the land. And Land's End was exceptional because the Highlanders I studied there had nothing else. Like, they had only their land, they had only their agriculture, and they sunk or swam on their farms. But in most of the world, that's extremely unusual. Most rural households depend significantly on state transfers, pensions, Bolsa Familia, et cetera, on remittances, on pluriactivity. Like, it's very unusual to be so dependent on the farm. So what are the different ways? What are the different resources that people actually rely on? Again, we should be interested in this. So, that's another sort of questions. And the fourth one concerned social membership. So thinking about, we are of exactly the same age and same sort of vintage. When we studied anthropology, identity was understood as a matter of like tribe or ethnic group or village or perhaps nation. But what are the grounds of social membership today? Like, how do people find their affiliation, right? What's the role of youth culture, of social media? I mean, there's so many different ways in which people identify and become members of communities beyond, the obvious. Again, we should be interested in this and not think that we know the answer or that it's overdetermined. And the final one was a question of politics. If we actually start this do this kind of empirical research again, what we'll find out is that what people expect and demand from their politicians is quite diverse. I mean, do you expect your politician to provide you with jobs? Are you looking for state transfers? Are you looking for land rights? Like, what is important to people, what they will fight for, you know, what kinds of mobilizations will occur over what kinds of facilities. Like in South Africa, it's been over the right to urban space and water, for example, that have been the most effective points of popular mobilization. So this isn't obviously a class politics. It's not a laborist politics. It's not linked to unions or jobs. It's strike. It's not its most obvious vehicle, right? In Indonesia, a whole different set of things, right? So I think what we were basically arguing was for a kind of fresh empiricism that we could share, you know, anthropology, sociology, historians, geographers. And I think that the key that we sort of identified, the link, is being interested in what we called this kind of the specificities of the conjuncture. So a time, a place, a group of people, a set of social relations, a set of processes, what's going on there, you know, at whatever scale, but this interest in specificity and then understanding what generates this conjuncture in this form as a kind of shared analytical commitment, which is very different from a grand narrative, you know, which overdetermines, or from a kind of a theorization which usually amounts to some kind of pronouncement about the way the world is going. But what if it isn't, or it not everywhere, or not for all people, right? So being willing to embrace the specificity, and then I think some solidarity in not having our work dismissed as merely a case study, which is often the fate, right? Someone will, the criticism will be, well, you told me about a few mountain folks, but how representative are they? I was like, yeah, well, if we understand a process in one place, that's something, right? That's a contribution, so we have to defend it.
Muchas gracias. Pues le cedo la palabra al público si hay alguna inquietud. ¿Sí?
Do you want to take a few or do one by one? I'll try to go.
Thank you. I think I can. Creo que la puedo hacer en español, la pregunta.
Sí, como quieras.
Perfecto. Bueno, soy Jorge Nieto, exalumno de aquí del colegio, pero ahora trabajo en Producción México, una organización sin fines de lucro en medio ambiente. Entonces, habiendo cruzado las dos partes de academia hacia los non-profits, la conservación, la gubernamentalidad, ejerciendo la gubernamentalidad en cierto sentido, ¿cuál es su perspectiva de el papel de los antropólogos hacia los practicantes de la conservación, del desarrollo? No es un dilema que encuentro todos los días, de que sabemos que se tiene que hacer algo, sabemos que si no lo hacemos nosotros, probablemente lo haga alguien que lo haga peor que nosotros, pero al mismo tiempo saber que estamos atrapados un poco entre la espada y la pared, ¿no? Entre a rock and a hard place. Entonces, ¿cómo como antropólogos o como alguien que tiene esta educación antropológica podemos contribuir de mejor manera a informar esta práctica, ¿no? Si es desde la protesta, si es de la práctica, desde la crítica o alguna mezcla de las tres. Gracias.
¿Alguien más? Sí. Gracias.
Bueno, igual mi pregunta es en español y a mí me interesa más como desde el lado de su trabajo relacionado al diálogo con James Scott y el rol de los expertos como justo en estos proyectos de desarrollo. Entonces mi pregunta es muy sencilla y me preguntaba ¿qué nuevos horizontes hay respecto a esta relación entre expertos, Estado y y digamos sociedad en un contexto, por ejemplo, como el de las plantaciones, en donde las corporaciones cobran más peso o tienen un rol equivalente, no equivalente, pero bueno, están muy unidos al Estado, ¿no? Entonces, si cambia algo esta reflexión sobre el expertise ahora, o sea, si hay nuevos horizontes de investigación en ese sentido. Gracias.
Hi, Tania. So I have a couple of questions. One of them is related to your field sites. I'm interested in knowing how you come to pick those sites in Sulawesi. And the other question is more related to this idea of the lack of a counter movement in the Lauge area. So what would be, or how can we make sense of this, considering the religion aspect, or the role of, because I do remember at some point you mentioned there is a lack also of NGOs and other kind of social organizations. So I wonder, what is the role of the religious aspect of it? Thanks.
Okay. Okay, great. So the first one, between environmental organizations and academia. So it can often be a tense relationship. I've had some excellent experiences, and I would say the one with Will to Improve was excellent. And that is because the activists themselves are open to the empirical situation. So if you are working with an NGO which is very committed to a certain politics and a certain view of reality, and you as an anthropology critic questions that, so for example, my discussions of indigenism or the construction of indigeneity in Indonesia was not very appreciated by some NGO activists in this field, but actually quite appreciated by others who said, look, the problems you are discussing, Tania, we discuss these among ourselves all the time. And we acknowledge that there's a problem of scope, you know, who are the indigenous people, how to mobilize. So they appreciated having an anthropologist kind of give the matter my study. And they actually asked me to be the advisor to their organization, which I thought was surprising because from another point of view, I've always been a critic, right? So some activists welcome the challenge of working with researchers who will ask difficult questions, who will sometimes provide data, like the data in Land's End, which contradicts their sacred truth and their platform. And for others, like guarding the boundaries of the movement, keeping the narrative simple, what you might call strategic essentialism is more important. So that the relationship depends on the openness. I've tried not to damage anyone's movement, but I do think that as academics, it is our job actually to conduct research and write about it. And if this is destabilizing of certain narratives, I think that still should be done. So, you know, it's always tricky, no magic. You negotiate each relationship as it comes. But I've had very good experiences with activists who, one of them said to me, you know, what we don't want to do is action in a vacuum. Like we say we're acting on the part of the people, we're acting for the people, in the name of the people, but if we don't check back with the people, like what is actually their problem and how they would characterize it and what are their priorities, we as activists are not doing our job. So come help us. Come help us do this research, and from this research, our activism will be stronger because the connection with the people will be more solid, right? So depending on how they understand this dynamic. Yeah. So in terms of the role of experts, the role of expertise, it's definitely, I would say there's two kinds of experts in this plantation arena right now. There's one set of experts promoting the development of the corporate frontier, right, and saying more and more and, you know, better hybrids and something. And, you know, the Indonesian government has created Center for Study of Oil Palm in the universities, and it's funded by the oil palm corporations. And that's the only kind of study they want, right? Study which is supportive of the corporate complex. Then there's other kinds of experts who are critics and who the Indonesian government dismisses as being misguided, particularly if foreigners, it's like they only care about the orangutans and they don't understand that Indonesia is a poor country and, you know, we need jobs, we need development. So very quick to dismiss the other kind of expertise on the social impacts, the environmental impacts and so on as just misguided. And so it's very difficult actually to find a space in this arena. There's not, you're either talking to the converted, to people who already think there's a problem, or you're talking to people who are convinced if there's a problem, it's a small thing which can be fixed. There's no problem with the model of development overall. Yeah. Maybe there's some bad companies, but corporate occupation, like, no. Unwilling to understand the process in those terms. Field sites, how I pick them? Yeah, usually a bit of chance, right? For Land's End, there was a Canadian development project that was about to start work in this area with the local government on rural planning. So I thought, well, rather than just do research and say, hopefully someone somewhere will read this and turn it into policy, which is complete nonsense, I thought, okay, I'll do my research in an area where it's more likely that the agencies could be interested in my findings because they're already planning some activities, but they have no idea what they're doing. So if I offer them some research, maybe it will go somewhere and maybe it won't, right? So a bit of strategy there, I would say, in terms of where, yeah. Lack of a counter movement, how to make sense of this. So I had this might resonate with you in Mexico, but I had a very interesting discussion with Wendy Wolford, whose work you may know. She works in Brazil on the landless peoples movement and so on. She did a review of the book and she said, it's unfortunate that Tania did not talk about the social movements in her field site. I said, Wendy, it's not that I neglected to mention, they are not there. There is nothing there, no one there. But from her lens, working in Brazil, and from you working in Mexico, it's impossible to imagine a countryside with no organizations, no formal organizations, no co-ops, no base communities, no activist church, no nothing at all. And that's how it is. So it's this is one of the benefits actually of comparison, because it makes those who, you work in a context where you assume a countryside full of organizations. I go to the countryside in Latin America and I'm amazed by all of these organizational resources. People have histories of formación, of following this, and nothing like it in Indonesia. And that's deliberate, right? The government squashed all forms of rural organizing in 1965 with the massacre of the Communist Party and all of the affiliated organizations. And it was very deliberate that there would be no forms of rural organization which were not state managed. That was imposed in 1965 and it's still there. Even though there is the freedom to organize in theory, in practice, there's nothing. Or the NGOs work in the city, they have a project-based contact. So if you go to the internet sphere, you might imagine Indonesian countryside full of activism. But if you show up in any random village in Indonesia, you will not find anything, right? So if you follow activist routes, you find activism. But if you, in Indonesia anyway, if you don't follow those routes, you just go to ordinary villages, middle of nowhere land, you won't find anything. And the religious organization, there's been no activism coming from this source, either Islamic or Christian so far.
Sí, muchas gracias. Yo soy, well, I'm one of the students who is like majoring in Southeast Asian studies.
Oh, great.
And one of our questions, like we often ask, is like what is researched, but what cannot be researched as well. And I like these discussions. Like often is like I did my field trip in Southeast Asia a couple of months ago. I attended the AAS conference, and like I often heard, like, for example, it's hard to research about, for example, LGBT topics or the palm oil industry. Like, and you questioned me a bit, but like my question is like, is there like a scholarly literature about these effects of the palm oil industry? Like, and also like, is there some sort of like academic censorship, or is maybe self-censorship, or maybe there's none? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Tania, for everything you're sharing with us today. I'm curious about how does the law, because I'm a lawyer, I'm sorry, how does the law appears in your trajectory? Because, of course, you can study property relations as social relations without looking at the law, and that's very important and legitimate. But sooner or later, law appears, either with conflict or because there are government initiatives. So how do you incorporate this problematic into your work? Is it legal pluralism, other sort of socio-legal studies, or do you use national sources of law? How do you integrate this into your work? That would be my question.
Okay, good question.
Hola, yo soy Ismael, soy estudiante de la maestría de aquí del CES. Gracias, Tania, por la conversación. Yo quisiera hacer una pregunta muy puntual sobre, digamos, la espacialidad y las múltiples escalas de observación que se imbrican en el fenómeno. Especialmente pensaba en este doble filo entre la apropiación y la exclusión. Me preguntaba si has podido incorporar en tu trabajo algún tipo de perspectiva sobre la multiescalaridad, es decir, la manera en que este fenómeno se traduce en distintos niveles de relaciones que por supuesto se imbrican, se superponen, pero que a veces el trabajo de campo, etnográfico además, da para mucho, para entender cómo el fenómeno adquiere cierta traducción específica según el punto de vista observado, y en ese sentido me preguntaba si podrías hacer algún comentario al respecto. Muchas gracias.
Okay. This, okay. Brian, what can be researched or not? I think this depends where in Southeast Asia, like in Thailand, anything to do with the monarchy, big no-no. In Malaysia, much tighter control of research for Malaysians as well as foreigners in terms of the oil palm. Indonesia, you know, is a bit more open because they're less efficient in their censorship, and or because the industry is so dominant that we little people writing our little criticisms don't do anything to them. They just dismiss us all as, you know, ignorant people who don't understand. They're so confident of the master narrative that plantations bring jobs and development and good things for the Indonesian people that it doesn't matter what research you do, it won't change their confidence in the narrative. So in that sense, there's a bit more freedom in Indonesia. But specifically access, like, it's very difficult to get inside a plantation because they guard their boundaries. And so much of the research is based on outside but in this case, because Pujo, my colleague, is a university professor. University professors are government officials in Indonesia. He wrote to the head of the national plantation company saying he requested access for himself and his colleagues to do this research. And the head of the National Plantation Agency said, yes, okay. And we arrived in the plantation with this letter, and the local manager was horrified that we had permission. And they expected us to do what most researchers do, stay for 3 days and mess around with the files and talk to someone and go away. But after 3 months, we were still there with 100 students. And the next year, we came back, and the year after as well, because the permit said you have permission until your research is complete, which it isn't. So basically, I guess the story is access depends on your networks. So, in this case, Pujo had a network. I certainly did not have this network. So he was the one who enabled the connection. The research I did for Will to Improve, the network was the NGOs. I couldn't have just shown up in these villages. There was a very tense situation. There was violence at the time, right? It would have been impossible, but I didn't go alone. I went as part of a network. So there is a disadvantage because you are identified with this network, and then it makes it harder to study the other side of the question, but it does give you access. So I think for any topic, the question is, who are the people in the local context who are interested in this? And are they interested in collaborating with you, whether they're scholars or activists or whoever? And if they're interested in collaborating with you, it will open up. But for you as a solo actor, me, age 22, I would never have had this kind of access that I had. So the question of law, how does it appear in my trajectory? So, I could answer this kind of ethnographically and say that in the work that I did in Land's End, for example, I was interested in how people negotiated the privatization of their land. They were unaware, they did not know that their land was officially classified as part of the state forest. They didn't even know it. Because, why? Because no timber concession had ever been granted on their land, and no forestry official had ever taken the trouble to hike up these mountains and tell the people they had to go away. So for them, law is sporadic. It's like it arrives with a plantation, it arrives with a timber concession, it arrives with a government program. But if none of these things happen, you actually may not even be aware of what the law is or says or your formal position in relation to it, right? The only law you know is the one that governs your everyday relations with your neighbors. So obviously people in the plantation zone were totally impacted by law in the sense that they have only customary rights which are not recognized, and the plantation corporations come with a concession license issued by the government. So law is now confronting them, and they are very aware that because they have no papers, they have no land titles, they have no documents, that if they try to go to court, and some of them do try, they will always lose. Because the judge will say, where's your documents? And they will say, we have been here forever, our ancestors have been here forever, but we don't have documents. You are yourself, you are a Dayak, you are a Malay, you know very well the basis of land law, customary land law, is that who clears the land? It belongs to them. This is, customary version of Locke, actually, but this never works in court. So people's experience of law, and even my encounters with law as an anthropologist, depended on where I was working and what was happening in the environment. But what I also realized is that this lack, it comes back to this lack of organizations, right? The people affected by the plantations, they had no understanding that the law which enables the Indonesia's land law is identical to the 1870 colonial land law, which was written for the purpose of removing customary land rights and granting plantation license. It is mostly the same law and it has the same effect. But they have no concept of that. They have had no legal education. They don't understand that the law which enables the government to claim all of this land and say, this is state land, we can give it to a corporation, you people are squatters on state land. They have no means of understanding where this comes from, how it was entrenched in the legal system, or how to counteract it. So I think this is very different from a situation in Mexico where there's a much higher level of legal awareness, and then the NGOs that talk law all the time, and people learn about their rights and how to defend them. So the combination of the lack of intermediaries, who know how to bring law, but also the law itself. Indonesian law is highly damaging to the population. It's a colonial law. It was written to be damaging, and it is damaging. And they have very few rights. So yeah, patchy, I would say. I came to law late because I came to the plantations late. And in my earlier research, law didn't even come up. Yeah. So this question of scales of analysis and how to incorporate. One way I've thought about this, and I actually wrote about it in Land's End, is this idea of the conjuncture. So if you think about, a time, a place, a set of people, and what are all of the elements? I drew this from Doreen Massey, I guess. What are all the elements that form it? This idea of a conjuncture. So you could say some of those relations, spatial, temporal, social, are very immediate. Like, is my land facing north or facing south? Can cocoa grow there or not? Very immediate kind of spatial horizons. A bigger question, like, along comes a market for cocoa. Why does it come? Well, because there's a civil war in the Côte d'Ivoire, and so the production in Africa has dropped. Now there's a space in the market for cocoa in Indonesia. So you could say that's a spatial element it's a very long spatial tail, right? And other spatial elements are very immediate, and both of them are active in that conjuncture. And temporally, like I just gave the example, colonial land law has a very long temporal horizon, and then some other event, may be very immediate. So the style of analysis I've tried to adopt is, like, what is the problem you want to explain? And don't limit to say, I'm only interested in the local, because there's no such thing as the local. Like, the price of cocoa, it's there, present as a fact locally, but it's generated globally, right? And whereas the quality of the soil is actually generated locally. Like, you can't choose your scale. You figure out the problem you want to address and what is the temporal and spatial and social scope of the relations that form it. That's sort of how I've tried to address that issue, and I think it's an interesting way of avoiding this problem of levels, as if there was a local which is only composed of local things. No, the local is comprised of the colonial land law and the global cocoa price. They may not know it, but it is comprised of those elements that you can't ignore them and say you're only studying the local, because they are the local, right? As is all the rest. Yeah.
Bueno, primero que nada, muchas gracias. Mi pregunta se relaciona con la pregunta del compañero, porque debo decir que no he leído tu obra, una disculpa, pero conforme te fui escuchando, de repente justamente me daba la sensación, inclusive lo dijiste, ¿no?, de que era un empirismo muy fresco. Y también, como decía el compañero, ¿no?, o sea, como que su duda es en tanto a lo espacial, ¿no?, cómo hay diferentes escalas, pero tú ahorita le estabas diciendo que las cosas que ves empíricamente, me imagino, más o menos así lo entendí yo, están como determinadas o influenciadas por otras cosas que suceden. Pero también dijiste, ¿no?, que cada situación es muy particular y que no puedes dejar que la teoría te diga hacia dónde va, ¿no?, a qué va a suceder. Entiendo que no podemos decir del neoliberalismo, del antropoceno, de la lucha de clases, no los podemos tomar como modelos de cosas que van a pasar o cómo deberían de ser, pero sí me quedé con la duda de entonces precisamente cómo articulas o cómo dentro de tu trabajo se articulan estas otras cosas que están pasando alrededor. Entonces básicamente sería eso, ¿no? ¿Qué lugar tienen? ¿Cómo entran? Sí, o sea, eso es una cuestión más metodológica, me imagino, pero me llamó mucho la atención eso.
And there's one question from the people that are watching from YouTube. His name is Julio Cesar Morales. I think you already gave a partial answer to this. I think it's going to show how Latin America thinks different about things. But he's asking whether there's a conflict in the agendas of the NGOs and the local activists. He's wondering if it could be that NGOs are thinking more of global international discourse, while the second ones are thinking about political representation. Political representation, yeah.
So Miguel, it's a difficult question to answer. I mean, I think that, you know, definitely we read a lot, right? You know, how did Pujo and I make sense of the plantation complex, which we analyzed, you know, ethnographically, but we could not have understood it without reading an enormous secondary literature on the history of plantations, of the land law, plantation law, etc. Right? So these, what you might call scales, you know, research written in a different voice for different purposes, of course we draw on it. We can't do everything ourselves. So we were very clear about our goal in that book, which was what we tried to do was to give an account of plantation life. So what is life in the plantation zone? That we only tried to do that. Now, to explain everyday life in a plantation zone, you have to first study and describe it, but you also have to understand, well, what are the processes that form it? You know, clearly, there are processes operating at many scales which form this form of life, and we need to attend to them. So I guess that's the art. You know, in our case, we're anthropologists. We felt that actually what was really missing was an ethnography of plantation life. There's a lot of critical discourse about environment, about land struggles, and a lot of, in the context of land grab studies, a lot of discussion of what has been taken away, you know, customary land rights, livelihoods. All of this is true. But what we wanted to know is, yeah, well, what has been installed? Like, what is the form of life which emerges under corporate occupation? And we felt that had not been actually studied ethnographically, because the focus had been on what is lost, the environment, you know. But actually, millions of people now live under corporate occupation. How do they live was our question. So we had our own goal, and I think that dictated in the book, you know, the fact that 4 chapters are very densely ethnographic about land, about labor, about smallholders, about everyday hierarchies and so on, and 1 chapter is about the wider context. So there was something of the wider context in the introduction. You know, we have to give the orientation, and then we tried to dive in deeply to the ethnography because we really want you to feel plantation life. And then we would move out again because by now you want to ask this. We all want to know, yeah, how does this happen? But the specific question we asked is, how does this carry on? Like, how does this continue? Like, we know from our study and so many others how disastrous it is. And yet it is sustained. So now we have a question, like, what are the forces which put this in place and sustain it despite the damage it does? So that was the question that we addressed at a different scale. And in that chapter, we are pulling back from our analysis and relying more on secondary data. So Julia's question, NGOs and local activists. I think Julia might be imagining NGOs as kind of transnational and somebody else is local, but in Indonesia there are not very many transnational NGOs very involved. The most active front are the national NGOs, the environmental and land NGOs and so on. And many of them, and then there's NGOs at the level of the province, the provincial capitals usually have. So those are local, and they are local activists, mostly university graduates, mostly unemployed, mostly young men, young women who sleep in the back room of the NGO office and do their work. They are often dependent on donor funding. So the problem that they have is that their campaigning is constricted by the coming and going of donor interests. So at one stage when donors were into biodiversity, and then they were into climate change, and then they were into red, then they were into... So that kind of NGO is very vulnerable to donor fashion. There are a few, and my friends in Central Sulawesi are one, that have worked really hard on trying to sustain an autonomous research and activist agenda, which is not just blown by the wind of the last day donor fashion, and it's very difficult because how do they fund themselves? This capacity, as I said, there's no political parties, there's no pro-poor political parties. Who are their sponsors? Who are their patrons? They struggle to maintain autonomous organizational and research capacity, but that's what they aspire to do, so that they don't fall into this trap of just running after donor funding and endlessly writing project proposals and shaping everything to a donor agenda, which is a catastrophe from the point of view of political work. Yeah.
Okay. Bueno, si no hay más preguntas, entonces podemos dar cierre a esta sesión del laboratorio. Y lo cierro con un pequeño reconocimiento para Tania por sus respuestas y todo su trabajo. Por tu colaboración. Y muchas gracias por estar con nosotros, por permanecer hasta el final, y bienvenidos a la siguiente sesión del Laboratorio de Etnografía, que es el martes.
Nuevo, muchas gracias por tu generosidad para compartir con nosotros tu experiencia, tu trabajo. Nos vemos el miércoles. Hay una sesión sobre etnografía e imágenes impartida por Gabriela Zamorano, que es una antropóloga visual con una gran trayectoria en México y Bolivia. Esperemos verlos por aquí y que tengan buena tarde.